welcome. Good to see large crowd. It seems like that's becoming more and more typical for the series. Really quick piece of housekeeping. The next lecture is next Monday night, Yolanda Daniels from Studio Sumo. So go ahead and make sure that you can schedule that one in. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Gail Fulton, Director of the School of Landscape Architecture, and it's my pleasure to be able to welcome our guest, Chris Marcinkoski, here tonight. Chris is an Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the founding director of PORT, which is a public realm and urban design consultancy whose work includes projects in Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, Denver, the New York, New Jersey Highlands, and as many of you probably know, nowadays they're doing work in Knoxville, Tennessee on a couple projects. Some of you may have seen this work. Certainly the landscape architecture students saw this work last fall when the co-founder, Andy Modrell, was here. He was at the state ASLA conference. And then we saw some of that work again in the work of Sanders Pace when they were here for the dialogue series, which I think was late last semester. Prior to his work at Penn and with Port, Chris was a senior associate at James Corner Field Operations, where he led the office's urban design and planning work, including work in Shenzhen, China, and Shelby Farms Park in Memphis, Tennessee, which again I think is another project that certainly some of the landscape architecture students had a chance to tour a couple years ago, and I'm guessing that more of you have had a chance to be at that project so far. Chris's design work and research have been widely published in academic, professional, and mainstream media platforms, recognized by such important organizations as the Van Allen Institute, Bauhaus DeSalle Foundation, the Graham Foundation, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill Foundation, the American Institute of Architects, and the Chicago Architecture Club. And in the 2015-2016 year, he was awarded the Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture from the American Academy in Rome. In 2016, he published The City That Never Was. If you haven't seen this book, I encourage you to check it out. And that's where he began to explore this phenomenon of speculative urbanization, which we'll hear more about tonight. And this work is then extended in a current project called Africa 2050, an atlas of speculative urbanization. I situate Chris's work amongst other important late 20th and early 21st century landscape and urban thinkers. For me, the work of Corner, Charles Waldheim, Keller Easterling, Neil Brenner is another person that's looking at kind of planetary urbanization. So it's important work that he's doing, and like I say, I encourage you to read it because I think he makes concepts that aren't necessarily always easy for designers, economics, politics, some of that type of stuff, very accessible and meaningful. And I recently came across the following quote from an essay by Chris appearing in the recent book, Infinite Suburbia, and it's one that I think landscape architects and architects should certainly be taking serious with regard to their role in the process of urban production. Speaking broadly about the disciplines typically involved in the design, planning, and implementation of the built environment, Chris writes, "It is imperative that urban design and planning become far more cognizant of and conversant in the political and economic motivations driving this production. Without such a reorientation, it will become even more difficult for these disciplines to have any agency in the speculative urbanization processes that will be a primary source of much of their future work." With that, please join me in welcoming Chris Marcinkoski.
You guys hear me okay? Is this working at all? Seems to be working. I'll put it a little closer to myself. Gail, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I have a lot of colleagues who have come to UT and raved about how cool of a building this is, so I'm super excited that I actually get to speak here. I will tell you that I'm going to be distracted by your pizza aroma, and if I have to stop and take a bite halfway through this, I apologize. So as Gail said, I'm not going to talk about Port. Port is the other half of my life, the professional work. What I want to talk about today is really my academic research. And as he said, it relates to a kind of phenomenon that I call speculative urbanization. I'm going to try to do three things. And actually, that reminds me I should set my timer. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work from where this started in looking at Spain and the kind of building boom and bust in Spain during the early 21st century. Shifting then to my ongoing research related to urbanization in Africa, and then sort of try to wrap it up a little bit with some of the research and student work that I have been conducting at Penn as part of my teaching in the landscape architecture program there. Typically, these kind of lectures tend to show you really good work that you want to emulate, work that is of high quality. Today is not one of those examples. The design projects I'm going to show you are highly problematic. Many of them are flawed from their point of departure. And so I don't want you to take what I'm showing you as things that are good, but actually things that we really want to be critical of in terms of our practice as urban designers and landscape architects and architects. Speculative urbanization, at least as I define it, relates to the construction of infrastructure and settlement that's motivated by political and economic purposes. That means it's not real market demand or demographic demand, but it's artificially motivated. This can be built, or it can also be policy. So the rezoning of land, the redesignation, reparcelization, these are all acts of urbanization, even if they don't lead to a kind of a physical transformation. And that's really important to know in these projects. Not everything I'm going to show you today is intended to be built, but it has a kind of political and economic motivation behind it. My work in this research is really interested at the periphery of cities, so at the edges or in entirely greenfield sites. So when we talk about development, we're not talking about the redevelopment of cities, we're talking about the construction of new settlement and new infrastructure outside of existing conurbations. And finally, we're talking about things that are really big. So I'm trained as an architect, I teach in a landscape architecture school, I practice as an urban designer. I'm interested in the big scale. So the projects I'm going to show you today are really hundreds, if not thousands of hectares in size. And because of that, they have a number of programs and a number of activities embedded in them, in the sense they are cities unto themselves. So for most people, when we talk about speculative urbanization, we think about real estate speculation, we think about housing. And there's lots of examples of this that you're familiar with, whether it's the Sunbelt housing boom, sort of pre-2008, the Irish ghost estates that sort of were contemporary with that cycle of building. You have Dubai, not just the spectacle, but the housing that was produced during this period of time. And so for most people, there's an idea that real estate speculation is really connected to housing primarily, and maybe office space secondarily. For most, in terms of the media and kind of the mainstream perception of this phenomenon, we tend to think about it being the product of the banks, of the financial industry, as being the motivators behind these kind of activities. And while this is true, the reality is that we are complicit in this work as planners and designers. We're complicit in it because we don't take into account the realities of what motivates these projects, as well as the realities of what they're likely to produce. So for example, it's not just the production of excess housing, but sort of radical social, environmental, and economic disruptions that occur from these kinds of projects. And it's this sort of mix of implications, mix of consequences, that I think are essential for us as designers in the 21st century. These are things that we need to be aware of as potential consequences of our professional activities. So I got started looking at this because of a kind of accidental trip to Spain in 2010. Not an accidental trip, a trip that was intended, but an accidental visit at the end of my trip. And Spain is a really great case study for this for a number of reasons. It's a Western democracy, as you well know, but it also was a place that was economically underdeveloped as recently as the late 1990s. So it was going through a period of economic maturation. It was going through a period of kind of political restructuring, but at the same time, it had this sort of democratic base, this kind of economic base that's similar to what we see in the United States and elsewhere in Western Europe. In some ways, Spain connects with both the developing countries of, say, China and the Middle East, as well as with the West, and thus it's a kind of useful case study for thinking about these questions. This is my shameless plug for my book. Gail already mentioned it. This basically was a book project that was released in 2016. I'm going to use it to frame kind of a bigger discussion today. This isn't primarily what I'm going to spend my time on this evening. To give you a little context with what's happened in Spain, there's a lot of data here. The GDP more than doubled. 75 hectares per day, which is about 150 acres, was being urbanized. 15% of the GDP was devoted to the construction sector. That's a very, very conservative estimate. It was likely over 20% To give you a frame of reference, during the sort of real estate bubble here in the United States, sort of between 2000 and 2008, we never got above 5% of our total GDP being related to construction and real estate activities. In Spain, it was more than 4 times that percentage. 7 million homes were constructed. That's roughly enough housing for 20 million people. You had new airports, toll roads, metro lines, all sorts of infrastructure and cultural venues in addition to the housing. Most of what the media focused on was the excess of residential properties that were produced, but really there was a whole other kind of catalog of projects that were created during this period of time. What you had as a result was a country that boomed economically, despite not necessarily having the corresponding population growth that one would imagine driving that. All that's to say that basically 1/3 of all urbanized land in Spain was produced during this decade alone. When you think about the history of that country, you think about the significant kind of story it played in colonial times, in urbanizing the quote-unquote New World. The fact that 1/3 of this urbanized territory was produced in a single decade alone is a pretty astronomical figure. As I said, most of the kind of discourse around this event focused on housing, but really to understand the housing, you have to understand 2 other things, which are land policy and infrastructure policy. Now, in design school, we tend to not talk about land policy and infrastructure policy. I think that's a planning concern. That's something that economists do or political scientists do. But the reality is that those policies shape the way that urban design and architectural design, landscape design, went about their work during this decade. So this slide is super small. It's probably difficult to read. The point of it is basically to say that essentially land policy in Spain had always been a kind of political football. When the sort of center-right party was in power, there was a belief that land policy was too restrictive, and they wanted to open up the development of land as a way of increasing economic production. When the center-left party was in power, they wanted to limit where urbanization could take place. They wanted to control where building occurred as a way of not denuding the landscape and causing excessive sprawl. What's fascinating about what happened in Spain is that by 2000, 1998, 2000, you had the kind of belief in urbanization that crossed party lines. So whether you were in the Communist Party or you were in the kind of Fascist Party or anywhere in between that spectrum, you understood urbanization as the kind of recipe for economic development in the country. So what happened in Spain was actually a national policy that was enacted that basically said any land that isn't environmentally significant or dangerous to build in can be developed, essentially opening up the whole country to urbanization. That law was struck down because it was at the national level, and Spain is essentially governed by more regional legislation. But what happened is after that national law was struck down, every individual municipality, every individual region in the country enacted a similar law of their own. So regardless of their political party, they wanted to promote urbanization as a way of increasing economic growth. In combination with that, you had the arguments for the fact that a lot of the housing in Spain was conceived of or considered to be substandard. So much of what was built in the 1950s and 60s was intended to be replaced by this policy. What ended up happening is that it wasn't replaced, simply new housing was built. The other ingredient that went into this was a massive amount of infrastructural investment. So for those of you who know a little story of the European Union, there's something called Cohesion Funds. And Cohesion Funds are basically a way for the countries within the EU to balance their economies. And countries whose economies are lagging get Cohesion Funds to elevate the production of their economies. Spain was one of these countries in the late 90s. Its economy was not as strong as France or Germany or England or even, say, Italy at that moment in time. Much of this funding that came in from the EU went to things that were intended to build economic growth, infrastructure. So railway, high-speed railway, highway lines, airports, a massive infrastructural building boom took place during this period of time that was unlike anything that had been seen in Europe, really at this scale during this relatively compressed period of time. In addition to housing, in addition to infrastructure, you also had a huge amount of cultural production. So you had the Calatravas, the Hadids, the Eisenmans, the Niemeyers, building museums, building cultural facilities throughout the country. Not just in the major cities, not just in Valencia and Madrid and Barcelona, but really throughout the country in the small towns and regional capitals well outside the population centers. As a result, you had a kind of celebration of building in Spain. 2005, the Museum of Modern Art in New York staged an exhibition called On Site. In the catalog to this exhibition, Terry Riley, who was the curator at the time, basically said there had been more building in Spain during that decade than had ever occurred at any point since the Roman Empire. So basically comparing the scale of building to the aspirations and the significance of the transformation during the Roman Empire. What this also implied was that the center of design culture in Europe had shifted from the Netherlands to Spain. And so there was a kind of celebration of this both economic model, but also this model of architectural production. What you got was a massive expansion of lands, as I mentioned. And so what you see in this drawing is basically the growth quantity-wise of each of the major cities. Everywhere from Madrid growing by nearly a third to smaller municipalities like Guadalajara almost doubling their size during this period of time. This map's a little bit tough to read, but basically what it's saying is that the dark gray is the urbanized land in Madrid in 2013. The pink is the land that had been started to be urbanized but was never finished. It was basically abandoned or stopped because of the economic crisis. It's basically 25% of the land mass, of the urbanized land mass in Madrid has not been completed and likely will never be completed. So what you see here is basically a drawing that talks about the historic core of Madrid, the 19th century expansion, which took approximately 50 years to complete, the 20th century expansion, which was roughly 100 years, and then the growth that was intended to occur in about a 10-year period. That was the scale of transformation that was going on here. And so it produced landscapes like these. This is an area to the southeast of Madrid that's considered complete, despite the fact of the numerous number of vacant parcels, as well as the kind of low occupancy rate of many of those housing developments. And as you can see, much of this is fermented by this massive amount of infrastructure that's produced around it. At the ground level, these are the kinds of landscapes that were produced. This was about housing populations that were going to immigrate from South America, that were going to immigrate from Eastern Europe, populations that as soon as the economy in Spain tanked, left Spain and went elsewhere looking for jobs and looking for economic opportunity. These are a series of images from the eastern edge of Madrid showing you the kind of scale of transformation. These are not cranes in process, these are cranes stopped. This is a fascinating image because this is actually the largest informal settlement in Europe. Interestingly enough, the planning stopped short of displacing that informal settlement, but that actually has a higher population density, obviously, than any of this new development. This is another image that begins to show the scale: 1 project, 2 projects, 3 projects, residential, a massive industrial estate, and then in the distance, an adjacent municipality which has undertaken its own residential development projects during this period of time. What that gets to is this idea that it wasn't just the major cities that were urbanizing, were urbanizing in a kind of speculative fashion. It was every town and municipality. So villages that had been 200 people for centuries suddenly felt that they were going to be able to occupy more than 1,000, 1,500 new homes. And so it was this kind of lack of coordination between the capital and the core and many of these smaller municipalities outside of it that really exacerbated the consequences of this event. So one of those examples is Ciudad Valdeluz. This is a new town development that was intended for about 35,000 people to live here, 65 kilometers northeast of Madrid. It was predicated on a high-speed rail line that was being built from Madrid to Zaragoza. No stops between Madrid and Zaragoza until a certain politician convinced the state to build a stop on land that they owned. Once that stop was designated, they were able to sell that land, and this new development was initiated. This development ultimately resulted in the largest bankruptcy in Spain's history, the property developer behind it. And just to give you a scale of what was proposed, it's roughly the same size as the historic core of Madrid, intended to be developed and occupied in 10 years with a population density of 1/10. What's actually there now is a population density of about 4 or 5 people per hectare. And that's the kind of denuded landscape that you're left with. An amazing amount of infrastructure that's installed, huge amounts of housing that are under-occupied, and really no amenity or no provisions for life other than basic housing. In addition, the high-speed rail line that was supposed to connect this place to the city doesn't operate. What's interesting is that the same municipality that undertook the development of this project also undertook smaller developments like these. And so this massive expectation that both simply by building it, the people would come, the investment would come, and you're left with these landscapes of incomplete and unoccupied urban fabrics. It wasn't, as I said, just housing. It was also infrastructure. So you have a massive privately developed airport, 265 kilometers southwest of Madrid. This was supposed to be Madrid's second airport. 265 kilometers south of it, its second airport. Again, it was predicated on an idea that if you had a high-speed rail connection, people could land at this airport, hop on the rail, and be in the capital in an hour and 20 minutes. That high-speed rail connection never came. The airport opened for 6 months and then was shuttered. It was recently sold to a Chinese investor for about about 1/10 of what its original investment value was. No one's quite sure what they're going to do with the property. This drawing basically makes the point that in this context, this is not just about urbanization, but it's about the economy. So what you see here is all of the small regional savings banks that were behind these projects. These were small banks that loaned the money to the developers who are behind these initiatives. What you see is that in 2008, you have this radical consolidation of more than 100 individual regional savings banks into about 10, actually 12 larger state or national scale banks. So the connection between urbanization, between the design and planning work that we do, and kind of economic consequence is explicit. There should be no question about it. The question is, how do we take that into account in the work that we do? So many of you were probably quite young in 2008, but I'm sure you remember the kind of stress on your parents' faces during the kind of economic downturn, the kind of protests that were going on during this period of time. And I would argue that, although the financial institutions had a major role, the political institutions had a major role in these events, design and planning also had a role to some regards. What's interesting is if you think back to that moment in time, there was this kind of sense of never again, that this was such a catastrophic circumstance that we as a culture, we as a society, can't allow these events to reoccur. The reality is 4 years later, you had the same kind of speculative building going on, not only in New York, but also across the globe. So any lessons learned any lessons that were learned from 2008, from 2009, were quickly forgotten in favor of new projects and new opportunities to build. What's fascinating about Spain is that they subscribed to that solution. They subscribed that the answer to their economic crisis that was induced by building was to build more. So in 2012, they were pursuing a project called Eurovegas. Madrid was competing with Barcelona to build the largest casino in Europe. Sheldon Adelson, who I'm sure you all know, was behind this project. Ultimately, it was awarded to a suburb of Madrid, and the only reason the project wasn't initiated was because Adelson couldn't get the European Union to waive their smoking laws. So he wasn't going to build Eurovegas if you couldn't smoke. At the same time, you also had Madrid pursuing the Olympics for the third time. Most of us know that Olympics are not the kind of economic panacea that they are often sold to be. So what you had is a country and a capital who thought the way out of their building crisis was to build more. And while shocking that may be to us, when you actually look across history, it's not surprising. There's a number of events that occur, particularly in context of developing economies, where you have massive amounts of speculation. So the Harvard economist Ed Glazer has identified these just within the United States, at least 8 of them that have occurred in our country alone. And what I attempted to do was sort of identify other ones throughout Western economies. So you had examples: Panic of 1873, real estate investment of the Transcontinental Railroad, the checkerboarding of land, and a massive speculative bubble that ensues because of that. You have the opening up of exotic landscapes in California a decade or so later. A whole series of examples within the United States of real estate speculation leading to economic catastrophes and social crises. Florida is a really interesting one from the 1920s. Those of you who know any of this sort of history know that there are a number of historians who basically say that the real estate bust in Florida led directly to the Great Depression, in the sense that everybody thought that real estate was a risky proposition and that the stock market was safe. So they took all their money out of land and out of housing, and they put all their money in the stock market, inflated a bubble, and we all know what happened in 1929. So the kind of relationship between building and the economy becomes, again, very clear. What's fascinating, though, when you start to look at these speculative projects, this real estate speculation, is what the focus is and how that focus has changed. So in the 19th century, you're looking at speculation, or even earlier than the 19th century, speculation on land and agriculture, the kind of things that can be grown off a piece of land. By the mid to late 19th century, you had speculation on infrastructure, the canals, the railways, other kinds of large-scale transportation investments. By the 20th century, you had speculation on buildings, housing, office space, which you saw in Japan and in Malaysia and in Korea, as well as here in the United States. But when you get to the 21st century, all of those things get conflated into speculation at the scale of the city. It's no longer speculation about a product, but it's actually a speculation about the entirety of the urban complex. What I argue is that is indicative. It's indicative of a particular shift that has occurred where city building is now seen as the answer or the ultimate form of economic production. So whereas in the past, as economies grew, you would build, what we now see is a desire to build as a way of creating an economy. And that's fundamental because we're no longer providing basic services, but actually projecting a kind of potential status that actually hasn't yet been achieved. You see this, that even during that period of time, during the 2008, 2009, 2010, that you had development at this scale, speculative development at this scale, ongoing outside of the kind of Western context. So in Panama, in Turkey, as well as in China, you saw examples of these kind of projects continuing on. This is one of my favorite ones, keep calm, there is no bubble. If there's one thing that I've learned from this research, it's that as soon as you find a project that says this project is different, this project is unlike all of the others that preceded it that failed, when someone says this time it's different, you know that it's exactly the same and you should run as quickly as you can to get away from it. So all that's to say that the speculative environment has shifted now. It's no longer in the West, it's no longer in Southeast Asia, but has actually now found a new epicenter on the African continent. And this is really where my research is currently working, and I want to sort of spend the next 15 minutes or so kind of talking about this in terms of its implications for us as planners and designers. So there's a reason for this shift to Africa. One is population projections. Basically, in the next 30 years, you're going to see the population on the continent double. By the turn of the century, it's going to basically qualify for about 40% of the total population of the Earth. You have those projections in combination with substandard infrastructure and substandard housing. Not a dissimilar story to what we saw happen in Spain, not a dissimilar story to what we've seen happen in China. There's no question that there's a need for upgrading infrastructure and upgrading settlement in these contexts. The question is about the kinds of formats of settlement and the kinds of formats of infrastructure that we're utilizing for that upgrading. The appropriateness of these kind of globalized images of the city in contexts where they don't necessarily fit. So I want to stop here and make a statement, because I know for my colleagues who are in the sciences or in the social sciences in particular, talking about Africa as a whole thing gets me a lot of eye rolls. They say, how can you possibly think at the scale of the continent? How can you address anything this big? And the reality is, I acknowledge the radical range of differences, the radical diversity of contexts, both economic, geologic, geographic, political, historical on the continent. I mean, you see how big it is. You can fit China, the United States, India, and most of Western Europe in there. In the context of all of that difference, the fact that urbanization is being undertaken in the identical fashion, regardless of whether you're in Egypt or Ethiopia or Equatorial Guinea, is indicative of a problem with that urbanization process. That the image of the city, the model of the city, the recipe of the city is highly flawed in the sense that it's not being calibrated in any way to the massive difference that you have in a continent of this scale. So this is a little out of date, this slide, but basically as of right now, we've identified about 120 new town projects that have been initiated in the last 12 years across the African continent. Those projects are of a particular scale, greater than 200 hectares. Most of them are much larger than that, more like 1,000, 2,000 hectares. And these are all outside of existing urban centers. These are in peripheral sites or in entirely greenfield sites. And you see their distribution. Much of it is on the coast. Much of it is related to countries that have significant material resources that they're able to use as the kind of collateral to undertake these projects. The new town phenomenon in Africa is not a new one. New towns have been undertaken on the continent since the colonial times post-World War II. And while many of these examples were highly problematic, they did have one thing in common. They tended to be very innovative, and they were testing ideas. They were about experimentation. They were about advancing ideas of settlement and ideas of urban form and urban occupation. Some of them were successful, some of them failed, but it was about something new, different ideas of settlement. What's challenging today is that much of the products that are being deployed are not about anything innovative, nothing about locally calibrated, but they're a kind of generic ideal of the city. And that generic ideal is borrowed from other places. It's borrowed from economic contexts that are seen as having a successful recipe or a successful model to emulate. So China in particular is often held up as one of these places that is a source of the model of urbanization being seen in Africa. The Middle East is another source. And there's a lot of question about the degree of involvement of these states, of corporations and actors from these states in terms of what's being built across the African continent. In reality, China's role in this kind of work is not that high. Their involvement in signature or spectacle infrastructure projects is quite high, but settlement is not something that they're actively involved in. But the point being is that innovation is not an interest here. It's simply replication of an urban model that is presumed to have been successful successful in another context and is thus being borrowed and deployed here. So I like to use this project because it's called Newtown, and that's exactly what we're looking at. But this is a proposal that's pretty indicative of the kinds of projects that we're looking at. This is a proposal for a development outside of Nairobi in Kenya. And they have the same recipe. They have very, very similar recipes. You've got a kind of industrial area, you've got a new CBD, you've got a kind of commercial zone, a major sort of public realm feature at the center, a large water feature, and lots of different formats of housing, all set into a lush green landscape that doesn't actually exist in the place that's being proposed. The other thing that they have in common is a set of deficiencies. So there's a set of ingredients that go into them, and there's also a set of deficiencies. These projects tend to be highly isolated. There's no infrastructure actually connecting them. They tend to be pretty monofunctional. Despite all of the ingredients I just showed you, they tend to be housing driven. There's limited access both physically but also economically. Many of them are portrayed as being for the kind of emerging middle class, but are actually financially inaccessible to those populations. There's no culture, there's sort of nothing there. There's no account of the ground that they're being built on. There's a lack of amenity and there's a lack of infrastructure. But the thing that I'm most interested in is the fact that all of these projects are focused on an outcome. They're focused on an end product, an image of urbanization, as opposed to the realities of the urbanization process that will actually get these developments to those kind of conditions. So when we look through that 120 or so examples that we have, despite the kind of set of familiar ingredients, we can actually begin to categorize them into different typologies. So you have luxury housing and tourism, you have techno and industrial cities, you have new national capitals, a number of projects that range in terms of their disposition from purely housing into other kind of identities related to economic investment. And I'm going to go through some of these with you quickly now. If you think about the idea of projecting economic power and political status, there's probably no better example than a new national capital to sort of project those aspirations and those identities. So at present, there are no fewer than 5 new national capitals being proposed or undertaken across the African continent. In 54 countries, 1 in 11 is a pretty good number in terms of the frequency of these projects. What's ironic about them is just the kind of incongruity with what is actually there. So this is called the Green City of Bougazoul. It's the new capital of Algeria. It's a green city that's built in the desert, funded by petrol dollars. So I don't know how green you could get with that, but that seems like a pretty good start. The one that I recently visited was the new capital of Equatorial Guinea, which is essentially a new city that's being built as far away from the existing population as possible. So in order to visit this place, you have to take a 240 kilometer highway that no one else is on to basically go to the birth village of the dictator who is in charge of the country. And he's built this new capital, administrative capital, because he was threatened with coup about a decade and a half ago. And the idea is to move the government away from the population so the population can't overthrow the government. Seems like a logical basis for a new city. So we were lucky enough to visit this place with an architect who was our driver actually, but it was also doing an audit of the project. The project is essentially stopped now because they've run out of money and they don't actually know what they spent all the money on. And it included, a huge number of, pretty significant investments, both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of some of the architecture that was involved. And basically set into a lush, verdant, tropical rainforest that was essentially cleared for the purposes, jungle that was cleared for the purposes of building this new city. So you have these little moments of completion set into context of lots of incompletion. And so a lot of the images that I'm going to show you look self-similar. They look like things that are under construction, but in most cases they've stopped construction. They've been abandoned. This project included not only the kind of governmental facilities, but a new university, massive amounts of new housing, and the only part of it that's actually opened is a hotel. A 6-star hotel with about 350 rooms. We were one of about 8 people that were in the building here. And you know, it's got all the amenities you need if you were taking a touristic trip to the middle of the jungle in Equatorial Guinea. The point being here is that there's no reason for this city to be. And in fact, this is not the only speculative city in Equatorial Guinea. There's another one just adjacent to the existing capital. The question that comes about is the amount of resources that are being poured into these projects when you have a country that basically the population lives on $6 a day. Is this an appropriate investment? And we know the answer to that. The most common example of development that we hear about or that we found is called middle-class housing, or what's characterized as middle-class housing. And again, this is about a population that's coming of age, a population that's reaching economic opportunity and giving them options in terms of where they want to live outside of the existing urban center. So Morocco is a sort of wonderful example of this. It has one of the most robust new towns programs on the continent of Africa. And you know, their initial project started with a scale of intending something for 450,000 people, and yet you know only have a population of about 25 to 30,000 presently. But as they went on with the new towns programs, they continuously readjusted them and calibrated them to be smaller and smaller and smaller. But what you're left with in many of these cases are images that are not dissimilar to what you saw in Spain. The installation of infrastructure, the installation of utilities, a bit of housing that's isolated, surrounded by a vast landscape that's completely disconnected from the existing city. So this project outside of Marrakesh was intended for 450,000 people. The city of Marrakesh is 900,000 people, so basically it was going to be half the size of a city that's existed for millennia, which is a pretty astronomical undertaking, and maybe not surprising that it's not yet reached a level of success. The next one in that sort of period was a smaller project, only 250,000 projected residents, outside of Rabat, which is the capital. And again, you see this kind of island of urbanization isolated from any life, any culture, any place, any job opportunities, truthfully, that anybody living here would want to access. And we can go on and on with these examples. And again, the question that I always get is, well, won't these things eventually be occupied? And maybe they will be, but in most cases, especially in the Moroccan examples, it's been over a decade since these projects have been built, and they're basically not completed and they're not occupied. The reality is that the majority of the population simply can't access these projects. And so until there's sort of financial incentive or subsidization by the state, these projects are going to remain empty. This was one that was, again, another adjustment. There was a desire to build a kind of industrial estate next to the project as a way to provide a kind of job center. Eventually, it was decided that that still wasn't going to work, and the project was finally abandoned. So, despite the fact that there is this robust New Towns program in Morocco, not all of the projects are ongoing. Many of them have been sort of stopped or paused. In this case, the only housing that was built were these 3 kind of spec homes in anticipation of that population. So rather than market rate housing, what the continent really needs is social housing. And there's very few examples of that social housing being undertaken. The ones that we have identified are in Ethiopia and Angola, and they have 2 very different backstories behind them. This project you've probably seen. It was in the BBC, it was in CNN. This is basically a massive new housing estate that was built by the Chinese engineering corporation in exchange for petrol dollars, or access to petrol, the petrol resources of Angola. This project remained unoccupied until the state opened it up to subsidies to allow people to actually afford to live in this context. The one for us that was much more interesting was outside of Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, where you had not a external source of building, but actually building from within. You can see the brick manufacturing going on in the foreground, of a new area of social housing. And this was one of the few projects that we saw that was actually occupied. It's the same vintage. It started about the same period of time as these other ones that I've shown you. But this was a place that was super active. The quality of the architecture isn't great. The quality of the infrastructure isn't great. But there's a demand in this place that gives it a quality of life and gives it a kind of experience that one can see the potential successes of this as a first stage of urbanization. Not an end stage, but a first stage of urbanization. What's fascinating about these projects is that they're all self-built. Self-built in the sense that the local government is behind them. They've not brought in an external contractor to build these. And they're really not using any sort of advanced technological means. They're pretty much stacked masonry structures in a lot of cases with a little bit of formwork. On the other end of that spectrum, you have a huge number of touristic endeavors. And this one is actually just next to the social housing in Ethiopia, which is basically a new area of villas for the wealthy and the politically elite classes within Addis Ababa. That's the same cows that we saw in the other image. What's nice about this, or what's really fascinating about this project, is that much of it is being constructed by female laborers. And so this was something that we didn't see anywhere else on the continent, and frankly, I've never seen in any other context. But these villas were all being built by women, and they were almost exclusively females who were involved in these projects. So I don't know the story behind it, but it was kind of an interesting kind of context to look at. So again, luxury housing, the desire to attract capital from outside of the context, not in service of the population, but in service of growing an economy by building, not through any sort of productions other than urbanistic production. And then finally, in South Africa, this is Doan Stein, who's considered to be the sort of Donald Trump of South Africa. This is a large new development called Stein City. At the center of it is a villa that he built for him and his wife, 90 rooms, 120 staff. 2 people live in this villa. This was formerly the site of one of the, I'm blanking on the word, they displaced informal settlement essentially to build the golf course in the villa. And as you see, there's a very clear wall about what's inside and what's outside of this new development. It's not all housing. There are also examples of sort of industrially driven projects, so whether they're techno cities or industrial cities. And these projects tend to be tied to state development. So many of the other ones that I was showing you were privately motivated. They were kind of partnerships with the state and a private developer. These are projects that tend to be directly from the state. So you have Kanza outside of Nairobi, wonderful master plan by SHOP that is being proposed. And the likelihood is that this project doesn't have any economic impetus because there's no infrastructure that connects it. There's no real motivation for investment to come to this place. So it's not to say that these projects shouldn't occur. It's to say how they're undertaken and what the kind of process of that development is the question that we need to be asking ourselves as we start to think about their production. New CBDs, again, another format that becomes quite familiar, the kind of recreating the skyline of Manhattan or Shanghai or Dubai in the context of countries that don't even have the capacity to provide electricity or healthcare or education. And again, so it's this sort of disconnect between the kinds of investment that are going on and the reality of what's actually in need. What's fascinating about these projects is how much they begin to borrow from other familiar examples. So in the case of Elmore City, this is actually the World Trade Center. You can find architectural spectacle and architectural icons in these projects as signifiers to their aspiration. Not anything that's grounded in place, but about a kind of identity for the future. Egypt is a particularly interesting case study in this regard, in the sense that they've been building new towns for almost 40 years as a way of trying to solve the kind of crisis in Cairo, the overpopulation. And the most recent one, the capital Cairo, which is replacing New Cairo, is intended to basically be a development the size of Singapore that's achieved in about 15 to 20 years. What's interesting about these projects is it's not like these are hack firms that are behind them. These are major architectural corporations, SWA, SOM, SHOP, Surbana. These are firms that really frankly should know better than to be promoting these kind of speculative projects than they are. And that's where I think we have to start to question the discipline's role in these sort of exercises. One of these used to have one of the Petronas towers in it, but I think I cut that one out. So this is what you get. You get sort of an economy that's rooted in building, an economy that's rooted in housing production, an economy that's rooted in kind of the image production of the city, and not necessarily any other real economy. So again, I know they're sort of familiar. They all start to look the same. Is this Spain? Is this Egypt? Is this, I don't know. It could be anywhere. And that's exactly the point. It could be anywhere. They're not grounded in any real meaningful way. And very rarely do you get sort of radical redevelopment of existing fabric. And when you do get it, you tend to get it, there's another example of the World Trade Center. What you do tend to get is a kind of a jump. So in Kigali in Rwanda, a Singaporean planning firm has basically said that we'll recreate the model of Singapore in the Rwandan capital, and we'll turn this into this in 15 years. It took Singapore 50 years, half a century, to get to its current economic status. They established the model. How you get from this to this in 15 years it's a blatant lie. It's a fallacy. It's a way to sell an idea that is likely going to end in catastrophe. So the motivation behind these projects is simple. Project power, attract investment, create jobs, create revenue through tax resources, elevate value of public land, create an image of modernity. It's the reason that King Mohammed VI doesn't turn projects like these down. It's the reason that any politician doesn't turn a development project down. It's too good of a story. It's a way to cultivate support and get a population behind you. So there's a number of reasons why these projects happen. One that I'm particularly interested in is this idea of city rankings and why these projects are really so self-similar with one another. So city rankings are something that started to emerge in the early 1990s and were actually a social scientific metric as a way of measuring capacity. But what we've seen in the kind of 2 decades since then are various other ways of measuring a city against one another. How big is your airport? How many cultural institutions do you have? How many high-speed rail station passengers pass through your city? The rankings start to get connected to physical products. So the city is built, a part of the city is built as a way to elevate the status or rise up in some of those rankings. And so that's why you start to see cities start to become self-similar, that the recipes for growth are always identical. I like to look at economists not because I understand them, but because I think they have particular ways of framing these phenomena that are useful to us as designers and planners. So the Finnish economist Bent Flyberg has looked at what he calls mega projects. And these are not urbanization projects per se, as I've been showing you, but these are projects like nationalized healthcare, national high-speed rail systems, IT projects that provide telecommunication services to large populations. But in studying those projects, those large-scale initiatives, he's identified their kind of inevitable deficiencies or their inevitable failures. They always cost too much. They're always misrepresented as being more successfully than they actually are. Always fewer people use them than are projected. They always have a much bigger environmental impact, which I think is really important to us because as we design these projects, it's important to understand that they're always going to serve far fewer than projected and always going to produce far less revenue than anticipated. So mega projects are inevitably going to be failures in some regards. There's risk and there's volatility associated with them. Why don't we take that into account in our work? So what that tells me as a practitioner, as an academic, as a teacher, is that there's a kind of absurdity in focusing on outcome. There's an absurdity in focusing on the end, and what we actually need to think about is the process by which those urbanization initiatives take place. So rather than the preferred result, we actually focus on the way that we start. So what that means is that we know that we're unlikely to sort of shift global capital. Design and planning is not going to fundamentally change the way real estate development undertakes its practices, but we should at least be cognizant of it. On the other hand, it's irrational to ignore the kind of risk and volatility that's embedded within these projects. And as such, we need to sort of build that into the way that we think about our work. In that regard, as I said, we're sort of jettisoning the idea of preferred outcomes to really focus on what we call dynamic contingency. And that is to prioritize the way that we begin a project. How do we create adaptation, correction, and revision in the way that we structure our initial investment and our initial physical modification? This is an idea of urban planning that doesn't try to say completion is the only way that you can measure success. We actually have to find other terms and other metrics by which we measure urbanization initiatives to say, yes, they are achieving what we need them to achieve, or yes, they are producing something positive. Getting to the end, getting to the outcome is not a way to establish that level of success. So the title of my lecture was Why Landscape? And I sort of used that title for a number of reasons. One, I'm an architect pretending to be a landscape architect. Two, I actually think landscape is uniquely positioned to undertake and guide these projects in a way that is much more appropriate than, say, architecture or sort of conventional planning. And the reason behind that is what you sort of see in this diagram. When you look at the non-governmental organizations that are funding these projects, that are behind these projects, they tend to have focus areas that include agriculture, transport, water and sanitation, land use, and land tenure. These are in fact landscape issues. And if those are the priorities of these sort of governmental organizations, then we should be using them as the basis of, for rethinking how these systems begin to work. And such, that's in essence what I've been trying to do with my studios. So over the last 4 years or so, we've been conducting studios in Africa in various places, in Botswana and Morocco, that with the intent of creating a kind of operating system for urbanization. And again, this isn't about a kind of final plan or a final framework, but thinking about those sort of activities and infrastructures that can lead to urbanization, but can also be stopped at any point and still prove to be successful, still prove to be productive. This is kind of work in progress at this point, basically thinking about a set of actions, a set of activities that might allow us to reframe or inflect the development process as opposed to trying to blow it up and completely offer some other alternative. We're actually interested in sort of coming at it from the inside as opposed to standing outside of it and casting stones at its deficiency. So I'll give you just very quickly a couple of examples just to wrap up. As I mentioned, this is this sort of new development outside of Tangier that we are looking at. That was intended to be about 200,000 people, was connected to a Renault factory and a kind of new industrial estate between it that was then 35, 40 kilometers from the port of Tangier, the newly constructed port of Tangier. And we basically used this project as our case study because the Moroccan government had stopped it. Just as an aside, they tried to sell this project to a Chinese developer who said, we don't want that new town, we want to build another one up here. And they've actually started construction on that project, which has the identical format, the identical set of programs. It's just closer to the port. So you can throw away a new town if you want. It's not something that you need to hang on to. But we thought it was worth looking at this one just in terms of what's possible there. One of the things that my students looked at was the vernacular. And how do you use basic systems of managing water, managing land, managing erosion, and begin to think about how you scale those things up for the purposes of urbanism, for development at the kind of urban scale. And what we did is basically took those ideas that were appropriate in Morocco and then started to find similar examples as almost prototypes for other contexts. So looking at Kenya and sort of the sand dam as a model, other sort of contexts that we could borrow from, not to propose a specific solution, but to say there's a logic of urbanization, there's a format of settlement that can be drawn from this place that's radically different than maybe what is being imported from outside. And so again, thinking about sort of landscape considerations as the basis of settlement as opposed to the thing that you kind of decorate it with at the end. Similarly, the idea of contingency, land uses that provide economic production, whether it's through selling crops or it's in sort of temporary uses, and thinking about how you choreograph those interim land uses in the space of time when development does not have the pressure behind it. If development comes, you can displace them very quickly, they're cheap, you can replace it with new urban fabric. In the case where that urban fabric doesn't come, it still provides a kind of resource and a service to those local populations without actually displacing them. Blowfish urbanism is about the image of production rather than building out the entire city, simply building the edges of it, and then using the middle as a place that can be filled in over time. So some of these strategies are a little bit more playful, some of them are a little bit more serious, but the idea is saying, okay, where can we inflect in this process to produce different outcomes, to produce outcomes that don't have the kind of environmental and economic catastrophe that tends to go with these projects, as we saw in Spain, as we saw in the United States, as we saw in Ireland, but acknowledge the kind of risk that's embedded with them. Minimum viable product, the idea that you only build what you need, and once you reach a stage of a certain level of development, then you jump to the next area. So all of these are about contingency. They're about sort of a dynamic relationship with planning that's not fixed, that's not set, but it actually adapts to the realities of demand in time. And finally, the idea, if you're going to invest in infrastructure, it doesn't always have to be transport infrastructure. It doesn't have to be roads and rail and highways. You can start to think about infrastructural investment related to water, related to land management, that becomes the basis for settlement in a way that transport infrastructure has previously always been thought of as the basis for new settlement. So all of that is, as I said, really embracing this idea of volatility and risk in these speculative endeavors as a way of rethinking urban design. And, you know, when I was in school, urban design was kind of a bad word. It was where the not really good designers went to do work. I actually think urban design and landscape architectural-led urban design in particular has an enormous capacity and a central role in the urbanization process when we really think about how many new cities, how much new settlement is going to be built over the next century. If we don't sort of grow our capacity to negotiate these realities, all we're going to do is simply exacerbate the failures that come along with them. And with that, I'll end it. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer questions. You first and then. I never used that word, but I did suggest at it. I mean, the whole thing is about, the whole question relates to that notion of waste. You have limited arable land on the continent, right? You're consuming that arable land despite these massive population projections. You're basically creating a situation where you will not be able to feed the populations that are projected to grow. You have huge amounts of concrete and steel and other materials that are produced, they're installed, and then they're left. They're sort of abandoned. So yeah, the whole thing is, it's waste. It is a waste landscape that ultimately gets produced. The only example that I know of where any of these projects have ever been torn down is in Ireland. They actually, at a national policy level, decided that seeing the speculation was too psychologically burdensome, so they demolished them, threw them in a landfill. The debt's still there, all of the economic burden is still there, but the image of the failure was removed from the countryside, which to me is a sort of fascinating response, in the sense saying, we screwed up, but we don't want to acknowledge it by seeing it every single day, so we're going to hide that, and not pay attention to it. So I think the question of sustainability is really a question of how do we plan appropriately so that we're not destroying or denuding a landscape, but maybe even enhancing it. So some of the images, some of the projects I showed you of student work were actually about increasing the kind of ecological production of those landscapes in the interim before the urbanization took place. And so I think that it's a matter of how do you argue for that? How do you demonstrate that as a kind of potential value that you can use to argue for a different way of undertaking the development process? To say, actually, there's a revenue source over here that you haven't thought about that we can use that in the interim allows us to do something different until the market says, yes, we're going to develop in the way that we want, as a developer, we want to kind of undertake that work. I don't know if I answered your question, but. That's a super interesting question, because I think in many regards the examples that I've looked at they all occur when an economy is sort of maturing, right? So the 19th century examples in the United States, the US economy hadn't yet reached full maturation. In China, the economy hasn't yet reached full maturation. there's an inevitability of overbuilding during that period of time. The challenge is building in a way and occupying in a way that can last or can be repurposed in some ways. I think in the examples, of sort of American cities where you have sort of populations moving back into them and repurposing many of those facilities, you have a core around which those facilities exist. The problem with many of these projects is that they are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 kilometers outside of the core. There's no reason to be there. There's not job opportunities. There's not amenities. They're entirely conceived of as satellites that exist on their own. So this is a different conversation if you're talking about sort of tearing down and rebuilding an existing fabric. You're basically plotting these things in areas where there's nothing there other than land. And so there's no other motivation to return to them at some future point unless you can introduce a job center or some other activity. That's the sort of point that I made about urban growth used to follow on economic growth, right? You'd have job centers and then the city would grow. Detroit, right, for example. Here, you have no job center. You're simply growing a city with the hope that maybe an economy will grow up around it. So the inversion of it, in my mind, basically precludes the eventual occupation of these places. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, so I spent 3 weeks this summer sort of traveling and meeting with, surreptitiously meeting with private developers, not knowing the critical sort of point that I was making. But I had a number of them tell me that the reason that they're developing where they're developing is because it's just it's just easier there than in the existing cities because there's no issue with property ownership. That it was easier for them to acquire the land in these peripheral areas than it is to acquire the land in the cities, which makes sense. The other aspect of it is, yes, in fact, their public space as an ideal is fundamentally different in this context than in the West. The number of gated communities and walls and sort of level of security that is, almost all of these projects are gated in some ways. They're enclaves. As a result, that kind of inside-outside is something where the idea of shared public space is anathema to an idea of status or economic maturity. So I think part of the failure is that we talk about these projects in Western terms. We talk about them in modernist planning terms, and we've not yet developed a language of being able to talk about urbanization that is, I don't want to go all Kenneth Frampton, but is somewhat vernacular, is somewhat local to where they're being deployed. And I think one of the ingredients I didn't talk about, but is implicit in this, is this question of speed. How quickly do you need to build these things? The Chinese model says you need to build them as quickly as possible because there's going to be demand for them. In most of these cases, that speed, what is in demand is different than what's actually being built. And so I think how you negotiate that speed, the way that you talk about it in terms of the language of urban form needs to be recalibrated, or actually a whole new grammar needs to be created for these projects because the Western model is not applicable in these contexts. Which is, in some ways, I didn't show you any design work. In some ways, that's where we're trying to get next, is to not make proposals for specific places, but start to think about priorities or typologies or, as I said, moments of inflection that one could then translate and begin to calibrate to a specific place. But I think we have to be willing to operate on those terms, not in what the ULI tells us a good city, recipe includes. I get that question every single lecture I give, and I've yet to be able to answer it. Literally. So, I mean, one thing that I will acknowledge is that these projects take time, right? These developments are not, they're not, the city does not occur instantaneously. Everything that I'm showing you is 12 years or less, so they've not yet reached maturity. That said, given their sort of geographic location relative to the existing city, given their kind of the cost of being able to access those places, I can sort of presume that they're not going to be fully successful. I don't have an example of one that has worked, that has succeeded. I think the ones that in the long term likely will are the ones that are closer to the existing city. I think these developments that are, 50, 60, 70 kilometers outside of the city, there's no reason for them to be currently unless there's some other ingredient that's inserted into them, which is why I think the Morocco project is interesting, because it's trying to create a job center around auto manufacturing as the basis for that development. So if they hadn't abandoned Shafrat, I would say Shafrat may be the one that's most likely to succeed, but the Moroccan government has abandoned it at the request of the Chinese investors behind it. So maybe, yeah, right now I don't have one that I can point to that I can say, yes, that's successful.
What's the proposed industrial complexes or the industry use automobiles? Because it doesn't seem like a lot of people would own automobiles.
Right. No, so the idea was that there's no train line to it. There's no train line. One of the criticisms is that you have private development who undertakes these projects, and then they say to the municipality or to the state, you need to build the infrastructure to connect to our project. So it puts the burden back on the state to actually connect these places to the core. In the context of Morocco, part of the reason that they are using the automotive industry is because of subsidies from the European Union. Basically, Renault opened the first Western automotive factory in Africa. However, all the cars that are manufactured in there cannot be sold in Europe. They have to be sold outside of the European Union as part of the agreement for the funding model of it. So the automobile, yeah, in some ways, unless you have a car, you can't access these projects. But you can barely afford housing. Affording a car is a whole other question.
Just curious how industry has political or economic that
I think, like, I know that UN Habitat has a kind of research agenda related to gated communities, gated housing. We've talked to them a little bit about scaling that up into the sense of kind of gated urban enclaves. So there's a potential there. I think what starts to become really interesting is when you look at the marketing for these projects, the rhetoric behind these projects, they all talk about sustainability, they all talk about equity, they all talk about mixed use and sort of active public realm, and they use all of the rhetoric of Western development. The projects don't actually have those ingredients in them. They're used as a kind of marketing device. So even something like the UN Habitat Sustainable Development Goals, projects will make reference to those as the basis of what they're doing, but there's no evidence of that actually in what is being undertaken. So what we've tried to look at a little bit, it's a little bit of a black hole, is just to understand, the role that institutions like the World Bank or the IMF or the EU or any of these kind of non-governmental organizations play in promoting the activities behind some of these projects. I think the idea with this research is not to necessarily, I often get asked, do you want to design one of these? And I actually have in the Chinese context, and I did it not with the kind of awareness that I have now. But the interest that I actually have is by basically sort of calling attention to this as a phenomenon, that there starts to be some discourse that emerges around other ways of undertaking these initiatives. look, I mean, I have a firm. I know when someone comes up to me and says, I have a massive project for you, it's hard for me to say no to it. I think part of what you have to do is think about how your intelligence and your awareness can begin to subvert or influence the process in a way that might not be 100%. You know, you might not turn the aircraft carrier all in one swing, but you slowly start to kind of modify those things. So part of the interest now is in, as I said, trying to find those inflection points that one could begin to argue for. And I think one of those places that I've identified is this idea of value creation. And how do you create other sources of value for an investor that allows you to ask them to operate on a different time scale, that allows you to operate with a different kind of physical format, but you've got to kind of play the game. It's got to have, you know, it's got to have an image. It's got to be politically compelling. It needs to sort of generate. I mean, it's a development project. It's got to generate revenue of some sort. So I think the ethical dilemma is how do you participate, yet begin to inflect that process in a meaningful way, so that, you know, you could make the argument. I could imagine an SOM or a shop or someone saying, you know, well, if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it, and they're going to do a worse job than we do it. It's probably true. You know, so the question is, if you are going to do it, how do you do it in a way that is not naive or unaware of the kind of backstory or the bigger context that these projects tend to have behind them? And as I said, like you know, the last project I worked on at Field Operations was the design of a 4,500 acre new district in Shenzhen. And you know, we were moving subway lines, we were making land. You know, it was fun. It was great. You know, making a city. It was awesome. When you go back and look at it, and you sort of start to question the kind of the ethical motivation behind that, you know, to make that new city, they were literally chopping down a mountain and throwing it in the Pearl River Delta. Not a great project to be part of. But you know, so I think the obligation comes from being aware of what's going on and thinking about how you can participate in inflecting it in some way.